What if Germany won at Stalingrad? The butterfly effect that could have shattered the British Empire. In July 1942, the German High Command made a decision that would become one of the most critical turning points of World War II, an advance towards Stalingrad, an industrial city on the Volga River in the southern Soviet Union. By August, the German 6th Army and 4th Panzer Group had moved in, reducing much of the city to rubble. But a Soviet counteroffensive in November, coupled with brutal winter conditions, trapped and surrounded the Axis forces. The damage was immense, and by February 1943, the remaining German troops surrendered. But what if they hadn't? What if Germany had won at Stalingrad? Could the outcome of the war have been different, and could the British Empire have crumbled? Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Operation Barbarossa, marked the beginning of a titanic struggle between the two largest and most powerful nations in Europe. The operation initially went well for the Germans, who pushed deep into Soviet territory, capturing vast swathes of land and encircling entire Soviet armies. By 1942, the Germans were looking to capitalize on their gains by advancing into the southern Soviet Union, where the rich oil fields of the Caucasus beckoned. Oil was the lifeblood of modern mechanized warfare, and Germany's war machine was in desperate need of it to sustain its operations on all fronts. Stalingrad, located on the western bank of the Volga River, was not originally the primary objective of the German summer offensive in 1942. The main goal was to secure the oil fields in the Caucasus, which would not only fuel the German war effort, but also deny the Soviets the resources they needed to continue the fight. However, as the campaign progressed, Stalingrad became a focal point, both strategically and symbolically. The city bore the name of the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, making it a target that Hitler could not resist. The initial German advance towards Stalingrad was swift and brutal. By late August 1942, the German 6th Army, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, had reached the outskirts of the city. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, launched devastating bombing raids that reduced much of Stalingrad to rubble. Despite the destruction, the Soviet defenders, led by General Vasily Chuikov, dug in and prepared for a brutal urban battle. The fighting that followed was some of the most intense and ferocious of the entire war, with both sides suffering staggering losses. As the battle dragged on into the autumn, the Germans found themselves bogged down in a grinding war of attrition. The Soviet defenders, although outnumbered and outgunned, fought with incredible tenacity, turning every building and street into a fortress. The Germans, who were used to rapid, sweeping victories, were unprepared for the brutal close-quarters combat that characterized the battle. As winter set in, the situation for the Germans became increasingly dire. The Soviet Union's harsh winter conditions, which had played a crucial role in defeating Napoleon's invasion over a century earlier, once again proved to be a formidable adversary. In November 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive aimed at encircling the German forces in Stalingrad. The plan involved a pincer movement, with Soviet forces attacking the weaker Romanian and Italian units guarding the German flanks. The operation was a stunning success, and within days, the Germans found themselves completely surrounded. Despite attempts to break out or be relieved by other German forces, the 6th Army was trapped. As supplies dwindled and the cold took its toll, the situation for the Germans became hopeless. On February 2nd, 1943, after months of brutal fighting, General Paulus surrendered, and the remnants of the 6th Army laid down their arms. The defeat at Stalingrad was a catastrophic blow to Germany's war effort. It marked the first major defeat of the German army in the war, and signaled the beginning of a relentless Soviet advance that would eventually take them all the way to Berlin. The battle was a turning point in World War II, a moment where the tide of war shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. But what if the outcome had been different? What if the Germans had managed to capture Stalingrad and push further into the Caucasus? The consequences of such a victory could have been far-reaching and potentially disastrous for the Allies, particularly for the British Empire. Had the Germans succeeded in capturing Stalingrad early in the campaign, the entire course of the war in the east could have been altered. With Stalingrad under German control, The Soviets would have lost a critical industrial hub and a vital transport link along the Volga River. More importantly, the Germans would have secured their flank, allowing them to concentrate their forces on the primary objective, the oil fields of the Caucasus. The capture of these oil fields would have provided Germany with the resources it desperately needed to sustain its war effort, while simultaneously depriving the Soviet Union of the fuel required to keep its armies and industries running. A German victory at Stalingrad would have had a domino effect, leading to a series of potentially catastrophic outcomes for the Allies. With the oil fields of the Caucasus in German hands, the Soviet Union would have faced a severe resource crisis. The Red Army, already stretched thin by the demands of the war, would have struggled to maintain its fighting capacity without access to the oil needed to fuel its tanks, trucks, and aircraft. This could have forced the Soviets to sue for peace, or at least halt their advance, allowing Germany to consolidate its gains in the east and potentially shift resources to other fronts. The implications of a German victory at Stalingrad extend beyond the Eastern Front. With the Soviet Union weakened and unable to mount a counter-offensive, Germany could have pursued an alternative strategy, one that threatened the British Empire itself. The Germans might have pushed south through the Caucasus into the Middle East, targeting the vital oil fields of Iran and Iraq. Such a move would have been a direct threat to the British Empire's lifeline, cutting off the flow of oil that was crucial to Britain's war effort. The British Empire, already strained by the demands of a global war, would have faced a severe crisis if its access to Middle Eastern oil had been cut off. The loss of these resources would have crippled Britain's ability to sustain its military operations, both in Europe and in the Far East. The Royal Navy, which relied heavily on oil to fuel its ships, would have been particularly vulnerable. Without a steady supply of oil, Britain's ability to defend its vast empire, including key territories such as India, would have been severely compromised. The collapse of British control in the Middle East could have triggered a chain reaction, leading to uprisings and revolts in other parts of the empire. In India, where nationalist sentiments were already on the rise, the loss of British power in the region could have emboldened leaders like Mahatma Gandhi to push for independence more aggressively. Similarly, in the Middle East, nationalist movements in countries like Egypt and Iraq could have gained momentum, further eroding British influence in the region. Moreover, the potential involvement of Japan in the conflict could have further complicated the situation for the Allies. If Germany had succeeded at Stalingrad, Japan might have been emboldened to declare war on the Soviet Union. This would have opened a second front for the Soviets, stretching their resources even thinner and possibly forcing them to divert troops from the Western Front. A Japanese attack from the east, combined with a German push from the west, could have been catastrophic for the Soviet Union. The Red Army, already stretched thin, might have been unable to resist a two-pronged assault. This could have led to a rapid collapse of Soviet defenses, with the Germans and Japanese potentially meeting somewhere in Central Asia, effectively splitting the Soviet Union in two. The impact of such a scenario would have been felt far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. The Allies, already struggling to contain the Axis powers, would have been forced to rethink their entire strategy. With the Soviet Union potentially knocked out of the war, the burden of defeating Germany and Japan would have fallen even more heavily on the United States and Britain. The war, already a global conflict, could have escalated even further, with the potential for new fronts to open up in the Middle East and Central Asia. While a German victory at Stalingrad could have significantly altered the course of the war, it's important to consider the long-term consequences. Even with control of Stalingrad and the Caucasus, Germany would still have faced immense challenges. The war would likely have dragged on for years, with the Germans struggling to maintain their overstretched supply lines and the Allies regrouping for a counterattack. The sheer size and resource base of the Soviet Union, combined with the industrial might of the United States, would have made it incredibly difficult for Germany to achieve ultimate victory. The war might have been prolonged, but the outcome, a defeat for Nazi Germany, would likely have remained the same. However, the world that emerged from such a prolonged conflict would have been very different, with potentially devastating consequences for the British Empire and the global balance of power. One of the key factors that would have influenced the outcome of the war, even if Germany had won at Stalingrad, is the role of the United States. By 1942, the United States had fully mobilized its industrial capacity for war, producing vast quantities of weapons, vehicles, and supplies for the Allies. The Lend-Lease program, which provided critical support to the Soviet Union, Britain, and other Allied nations, played a crucial role in sustaining the war effort against the Axis powers. Even if Germany had captured Stalingrad and gained control of the Caucasus, the United States would have continued to pour resources into the war. American industry, which was far more productive and efficient than Germany's, would have eventually overwhelmed the Axis powers. The United States' ability to project power across the globe, with its vast navy and growing air force, would have posed a significant challenge to Germany's ambitions, even in the event of a prolonged conflict. Moreover, the moral and political implications of a German victory at Stalingrad would have been profound. The defeat of the Soviet Union, a key member of the Allied coalition, would have been a significant blow to the morale of the Allied nations. The Soviet Union's resistance against the Nazis had become a symbol of defiance and hope for millions of people around the world. A German victory at Stalingrad could have undermined this sense of hope and emboldened fascist movements in other parts of the world. The British Empire, already weakened by years of war, would have been further destabilized by a German victory at Stalingrad. The loss of key territories and resources in the Middle East could have accelerated the decline of British influence on the global stage. The post-war world might have looked very different, with the British Empire potentially fragmenting even earlier than it did in our timeline. Furthermore, the geopolitical landscape of the post-war world would have been dramatically altered. If Germany had succeeded in capturing Stalingrad and pushing into the Middle East, the map of Europe and Asia might have been redrawn. The Soviet Union, if it had survived at all, would likely have been a much weaker and diminished power. Germany might have established a dominant position in Europe, with a sphere of influence extending into the Middle East and possibly even parts of Asia. This new world order would have had far-reaching implications for the balance of power in the post-war world. The Cold War, as we know it, might never have occurred. Instead, the global struggle for power could have taken on a different character, with Germany and Japan potentially emerging as the dominant forces in their respective regions. However, it's also possible that the seeds of Germany's eventual defeat would have been sown even in the midst of victory. The vast territories that Germany sought to control, from Western Europe to the Caucasus and beyond, would have been difficult to manage and defend. Resistance movements, both in occupied Europe and in the Soviet Union, would have continued to harass German forces, draining resources and morale. The German economy, already stretched to its limits by the demands of total war, might have collapsed under the strain of trying to sustain a prolonged conflict on multiple fronts. In conclusion, while a German victory at Stalingrad could have dramatically altered the course of World War II, it's unlikely that it would have led to a lasting Axis triumph. The fundamental weaknesses of the German war effort, the overstretched supply lines, the lack of resources, and the inability to sustain a long-term war of attrition would have eventually caught up with them. However, the consequences of such a victory could have been catastrophic for the Allies, particularly for the British Empire. The loss of key territories and resources in the Middle East, combined with the potential collapse of Soviet resistance, could have fundamentally altered the balance of power in the post-war world. The Battle of Stalingrad was a turning point in World War II, a moment where the tide of war shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. But as we've explored today, history is fragile. A single victory or defeat can set off a chain reaction, leading to outcomes that are difficult to predict. A German victory at Stalingrad could have changed the course of the war, potentially prolonging the conflict and threatening the very foundations of the British Empire. The lessons of Stalingrad remind us of the importance of understanding history and the complex web of factors that shape the outcome of events. In a world where the stakes were so high, where the future of nations and empires hung in the balance, even the smallest decisions could have far-reaching consequences. As we reflect on the Battle of Stalingrad and its potential alternatives, we are reminded of the delicate nature of history and the enduring impact of the choices made by those who came before us.